Thank you very much for having me, and I'm pleased to be here to present flood preparedness of major Canadian cities, too little, too slow. Or in other words, when things go wrong along the lines of that which you see depicted on the left-hand side of the slide, water at a community level down to and including ultimately perhaps ending up in someone's basement, what can we, what's the degree to which cities are prepared for the potential of these type of events to make it such that when they might otherwise occur, processes are put in place to minimize or avoid this damage. And everything I'm going to say, or 90% of it, is presented in the report that's in the center of the slide, Climate Change and the Preparedness of 16 Major Canadian Cities to Limit Flood Risk. This is a report that our group released about perhaps 2 months ago or something like that. And it tended to draw a fair amount of attention in the country. I think we might have done maybe 50 or 60 interviews on it. I think 15 or including 15 or 20 in Quebec. So I'm going to present the highlights of this report without going into the details because it's accessible on our website to anybody who wants the details. I might mention also that we wrote a companion document to this report that was published last November, Climate Change and the Preparedness of Canadian Provinces and Territories to Limit Flood Risk. So you may wish to take a look at that as well. And I can tell you now that the take-home message from the presentation on the preparedness of cities in reference to flooding is, if the question is, are we moving in the right direction on flood preparedness? The answer is yes. Are we moving fast enough? The answer is no. I think we need to speed up. So having said that, if I could have the first slide, the next slide, please. By way of agenda, I'm going to highlight a few points. Number one, I'm just going to start with the fact that climate change is real and irreversible. For this group, people on this call, my guess is we don't have to spend too much time on the fact that climate change is real, but on the weekend, by the way, I happened to present to a group of very senior business leaders in the country who tended to be, conservative, small c conservative in terms of description, and they were not convinced that climate change was even real, never mind human induced. So there still are outliers there. But I do really want to focus on the part of the irreversibility of climate change. Climate change has happened, is happening, and will continue to happen. We're not going backwards on climate change. We should be doing everything within our power to lower the discharge of greenhouse gas emissions into the atmosphere to slow down change and to build carbon capture and sequestration technology. But we still have to recognize that we're not going backwards on climate change. So despite all those efforts, we need to prepare on the adaptation file, and we need to do so rapidly. I will just to give a quick synopsis of what the increasing costs look like in the country for expression of extreme weather events, again, underscoring the need to proceed rapidly on adaptation. And then I'll turn to the key findings of the report, what we did, how we did it, and what the key findings were for the preparedness of the 16 major Canadian cities. And we did, and I'll be showing data for 2019 and 20 state of preparedness, and I'll contrast that to virtually the same study that we conducted back in 2015, 5 years prior to, and do a comparative analysis. Where are we today versus where were we back then? And then the scoring of cities is presented very much like a kid in high school, their report card with a B- or a C+ or D+, whatever it might be. And I just want to say a little bit about the utility of that scoring system to drive the flood risk mitigation file forward for municipalities and the utility of it in that regard. And at the end of the day, that's why we're doing it. So having said that, next slide, please. So I think pretty much everybody on this call is well familiar with the IPCC reporting that for many years now has documented that climate change is real. It has happened, is happening, will continue to happen. We're up about 1.2 degrees Celsius warmer on the planet today than we were 100 years ago. And we know for sure in reference to this bout of warming that it is the burning of fossil fuels is the causal mechanism, period. It's not changes in solar irradiance or movement of the Earth's axis wobble on its axis, or volcanic activity or any other factor. It is the burning of fossil fuels, period. What's notable is the lower report. It was published by Environment Canada, Canada's Changing Climate Report 2019, where in that report, and this report was authored by about 8 or 10 climate scientists from Environment Canada, very good report if you have not seen it. But in that report, they document the following, and I'll just read it. Canada's climate has warmed and will warm further in the future, driven by human influence, which means the burning of fossil fuels. And this warming is effectively irreversible. And effectively is given a little bit of wiggle room there, but effectively, basically what they're saying is we're not going backwards on climate change, but not diminishing, by the way, that every effort should be made to slow down the rate of change by mitigating greenhouse gas emissions. But also in light of this reality that was recognized by the federal government, I think it very much opened the door for embracing adaptation more aggressively than has occurred to date. In the last 10 or 15 years in discussing climate change in Canada, I would say it's probably 90 or 95% of the discussion focused on mitigating greenhouse gas emissions, which is important, but only a small percentage or effort was directed towards adaptation. It was kind of like the cousin nobody wanted to talk about. But this report and other work coming forward showing the challenges of an ever-changing climate and expression of extreme weather really opened the door now to embrace adaptation more aggressively than was the case in the past. And I think we want to be careful that when we see things like the Paris Accord, US coming back in as a signatory to the Paris Accord, we talk about COP26 and objectives and goals, that's all great, but we might lull ourselves into thinking we've solved the problem. We haven't. All these things are good things to do, but again, we're not going backwards on climate change, so we need to prepare. Next slide, please. And again, just a little bit more painting the picture of the need to prepare and to prepare rapidly. What you're looking at here, and some of you might have seen this from a couple of months past, Craig Stewart and Arthur Lofsky presented some material that looked similar to this from the Insurance Bureau of Canada. But for those of you who didn't see it, I just want to document what do the actual changes, costs in the country look like associated with climate change. So what you're looking at here on this figure are the catastrophic loss insurable claims realized in Canada over the period in the lower left-hand corner from 1983 up to and including 2020. And in insurance terms, a catastrophic event is any event like a flood, fire, hail, storm, windstorm, whatever it might be. If it triggers more than $25 million in claims, that number gets added up on an annual basis and plotted out as you see here. And all the data that's presented on this chart for payouts has been corrected for inflation and for per capita wealth accumulation. In other words, if we were insuring twice as many homes today as 10 years ago, you would expect, with nothing going on, the insurance claims to be twice as high with twice as many homes. So that's been factored out of this data. And so you're looking horizontally, or as a function of time, a comparison of apples to apples. And what's notable here is that from 1983 up to 2008, the insurance industry could count on paying out about $250 to $450 million per year in claims, catastrophic claims. But from 2009 onward, for 11 out of the last 12 years, the claims have gone over $1 billion per year for an average cost of about $1.8, $1.9 billion. And the culprit that explains most of the upward bend in this curve is too much water in the wrong place, flooding. So that's why our report focuses on flooding, because there's a lot of things that can go wrong due to extreme weather. You can have flood, drought, fire, hail, wind, snow load, permafrost loss, sea level rise, etc. But we focus in on flooding because it is the most problematic and costly to the country, not to say that all the others aren't important as well. And flooding is at the point now in Canada, and particularly in Canadian cities, and certainly here in Ontario, where we have, and it's flooding at the residential level, basements flooding. We're at the point where we have growth in the uninsurability of the Canadian housing market, where in cities from Halifax to Victoria and a multitude of cities throughout Ontario, people are now finding out when their insurance comes up for renewal, they may not be eligible for flood coverage, period, for water in the basement. They can still get theft and fire, but maybe not water, given that they live in a risky zone or multiple claims made in their location, or the cap limits offered by insurers are coming down. The amount of coverage they will supply comes much more now into the zone of $10,000 to $20,000 as a maximum limit for basement flooding, when it used to be a higher number. This is problematic when the average cost of a flooded basement is about $43,000. So you're stuck with a flooded basement that's the average cost, and you have $10,000 in coverage, means you have to come up with $30,000 or $40,000 very rapidly to remedy that situation. So and think of this chart, by the way, although it focuses, I talked a lot about water, and these are the catastrophic loss insurable claims. This is just the insurance end of the equation. For every dollar spent on insurable losses, there's another $3 or $4 lost on uninsurable losses. And also, I believe this is the insurance payouts here. But think of this as almost a metaphor for risk that's in the system that's pervasive across all industry sectors. So again, all of this, what I'm trying to do is really paint the picture of why we need to really embrace adaptation aggressively. You know, it's not, extreme weather is not going away. It's going to get more challenging, so we have to get on board. Next slide, please. So, what did we do in reference to this study? We examined the flood preparedness of 16 major Canadian cities. All the details behind the cities we chose and so forth are in the report, but just as a few highlights here. Cities were selected based on the capital cities of provinces and territories. We also included cities that were key contributors to the well-being of the economy. And we wanted a range of cities, which by definition of picking capitals and from the provinces and territories, we wanted cities in the report that reflected a pan-Canadian focus. So presented the geography of Canada from east to west and north to south. The cities that we examined relative to these criteria, and a little bit more that's outlined in the report, were factored into groupings. We had one group of cities that ultimately for which we sent a benchmark score, calculated a benchmark score in flood preparedness, for cities that were in Western and Central Canada, and there's 10 of the cities, there's no point in me naming them, you can see them. That was one grouping of cities. Then we examined cities from the Maritimes as a separate group. These cities in the Maritimes thought that with their extensive coastlines that they should be really measured in a category different than the rest of the cities in Canada on flood preparedness, so we did that. And then we had 2 cities in the northern regions. And to evaluate the preparedness of these cities, and I'm going to show you in a couple slides how to do that, but we ended up interviewing 53 individuals from across the country who, that's collectively for all cities altogether. And each individual we interviewed to glean or determine elements of preparedness on flooding, each individual represented on average input from about 3 to 5 other people within the city that they had to go to collect information. So, and it would mean that they went to individuals such as, or we might have been contacting city managers, risk officers, public utilities people, conservation authorities, effectively people, in many degrees, a lot of the people with the background that are on this presentation. So overall, the input to the analysis and drew on expertise from probably well between 200 and 250 people. All interviewees were granted anonymity, period. I mean, we know who they all are and it's all recorded, but people will not speak freely or forthrightly if they think somehow it might potentially hurt them. So they're all granted anonymity. And all interviewees, people that we interviewed, they all signed off on their input. When I show you how we assess the data in a minute, when we received their input and recorded it, before we ever went forward with it or published it, ultimately, we sent it back to all of them, everybody, to sign off and say, did we get this right? Is this reflective of the information you gave us? And if it wasn't, we fixed it. And so we have sign off from everybody. Next slide, please. And by the way, we also, relative to the questions we presented to them, we presented people with trial questions to make sure that the system of evaluation we're using or invented was not too ambiguous. So we did some fine tuning of the system we used to evaluate performance with a subsample of people from across the country to say, does this make sense? And if it didn't, we adjusted it. On the left-hand side of the slide, you can see the number of interviewees from the various cities, ultimately constituting 53 individuals. And again, stressing that each person who provided input went to a lot of other people to get answers to our questions on flood preparedness. Of no surprise, you'll see the larger cities had more interviewees, which you would predict. The factors upon which we evaluated performance are shown on the graph on the right-hand side, and we had 7 categories of evaluation, and those categories had subcategories. But very briefly, and just at a high level of description, and again, all the details in the report, we had measures that looked at the flood risk assessment of cities. Are there flood risk maps up to date, fluvial, pluvial, and you can see there are subcategories for our focus. We looked at land use planning. Do they direct building development to avoid flood risk areas, for example? And these are descriptors I would use with the media. The details are in the report, as I said. We evaluated urban drainage assessment, the capacity of the cities to direct water in such a way to keep people and property out of harm's way. We looked at property measures pertaining to residential property risk preparedness put in place to help residential property owners not be flooded out when the big storms hit. We looked at mechanisms pertaining to protecting critical infrastructure from flood risk when the big storms hit. So maintaining the continuity of electricity supply, telecommunication services, transportation networks, water infrastructure, both water supply and water treatment facilities, food services, and financial services. If you went to an ATM during a major storm, could you get money out of it? We looked at public health and safety, and amongst other points is water directed away from not flooding out hospitals during floods. We looked at the preparedness of emergency management services, the police, ambulance, fire services, and so forth, that they're going to be up and running and they have continuity of the structures they're dependent on to do their job when big floods hit. And then all of those 7 factors factored into a calculation of scoring. And on a separate measure, we just said does your city have the equivalent of have a chief resiliency officer or the equivalent thereof. Next slide, please. So if we start with the first one, flood risk assessment, 1A, I just want to give you a sense of how we scored a city's performance. And it was actually on a numerical score that we can convert it to a letter score. But just for example, if we were focusing on 1A, how does the city develop and update riverine and or coastal flood risk assessments? A city would get an E, which is basically the lowest score, if they were at the point where they said the city is currently in the process of conducting a flood risk assessment of riverine and or coastal flooding. So that would just be on this one item. It means they're aware of the situation. They're putting some thought towards it, but they have no timeline for delivery of what they're doing on flood risk assessment. So that's basically about as basic as you can get. Then you can go up to the A, and I'll just read it and give you a sense of this would constitute an A. The city has recently, within the past 5 years, conducted a flood risk assessment identifying areas at risk of riverine and or coastal flooding, considering impacts of climate change on identified flood hazards. These would be forward-looking. On the basis of this assessment, the city updates flood risk maps and flood mitigation strategies and implements mitigation projects as needed. That would constitute an A. And then the city would get a B, C, or C minus, C plus, or a D, etc., depending on where they were from being aware at the level of E to being fully executing at the level of A. And then through a discussion with the right individuals in the city, they would come back and say, okay, we are at, according to this, a B minus or a B plus or C plus, whatever it is. And by the way, we did not audit anybody. We took them at their word. So we did this for all the parameters considered. We had 16 cities in total, 25 measures per city, which was constituted 400 points of assessment. This was a Herculean task. It took 2 years of one person, full-time devoted focus to do these assessments. And by the way, it sounds easy, but it was a giant task at first, just figure out who in all the cities across Canada to contact, who had this information, and then you had to assure that, I had to explain to them what we're doing, why we're doing it, and get their sign off to participate. So next slide, please. So what did the output look like? And I've just shown the output for 2 cities. We're talking about AMO, Ontario, so I picked Toronto and Ottawa to show in this presentation. But the way we presented the data in terms of strengths, weaknesses for cities and so forth, where are they really strong, where are they weak? If you look at Toronto, and by the way, the 3 cities in Canada that scored the best were Edmonton was number 1 with a B+, but sort of a high B+. It was Edmonton, Regina, and Toronto were the 3 cities in Canada that scored the best. The dotted line in the middle of this radar diagram, the weakest score you could have is if you had no color on this thing. Would be an E at the center, and the better prepared you are, the more dark space out towards the A. And the dotted line presents the average score of the benchmark cities all rolled together. So in other words, the 10 cities from Central and Western Canada, the average score of all those cities is presented in the dotted line. And then you can see the score for Toronto in the sort of the aqua shaped shaded area, and the same for Ottawa on the right-hand side. So you can see, for example, for Toronto, its weakest area of performance that pretty much matched the benchmark was in residential property risk mitigation or assessment. Edmonton, by the way, I just want to make a point. That line on residential property risk assessment was all the way out to an A, for example, for Edmonton, because they actually provide free home flood risk assessments through their publicly owned utility EPCOR, and it's the only city in Canada to do so. So next slide, please. So that's the system of evaluation, and we did that for all those factors under consideration in this subsets of the 7 categories. The average score for Canada, when we took all the cities into account, is shown on the left-hand side. The average score for Canadian cities was C+ in 2019 and 20. And then you can see all the individual scores for each city on the map on the left-hand side. When we conducted effectively or virtually the same study, or 90% similarity, a very good analog, I would say. When we conducted the same study in 2015, 5 years earlier, using the same metrics of evaluation, the score was also C+. So there's no, in terms of the average preparedness of Canadian cities, the score did not change. However, some cities scored a fair bit better today than they did in the past, which by definition, if the average stayed the same, means that other cities went backwards. So for example, Montreal and Calgary went backwards on scoring. Montreal had a lower score today at a C as compared to a B- in 2015. And that's despite the fact they've had 2 major floods in 2020 and 2019. And Calgary scored a B- today, whereas it was a B in 2015, despite the fact they had major flooding and hail damage in 2020 and 2013. So it's sort of a mixed bag of results across the country in terms of preparedness, but the average remained the same. Next slide, please. In terms of the utility of scoring, I just picked out, we basically heard from every single city that was in the evaluation. And by the way, there is a general tendency that mayors and senior councillors in cities that score high think the study is brilliant. Those that score in the middle of the pack sort of think it's good, but doesn't blow them away. And then those at the bottom of the equation who don't score so well, they can be upset with the score, but nobody ever tells us we were wrong. They may say they don't like it, and I said, well, I don't like it either, but they never said we were wrong. But in terms of reactions to the report, the scoring in the past and present, they were generally quite positive and drove behavior in a positive direction to facilitate flood risk mitigation. So I just picked 3 examples to read. In Edmonton, and this is a quote out of one of the newspapers, it said, "It's a much improved evaluation for Edmonton, B+, that's their current score, than the previous study in 2015, where Edmonton scored on the low end with a C." Ward Town Councillor Mike Walters said he brought that report forward to Council's Utility Committee at the time, and it was agreed upon that more work had to be done to prepare against flooding. Drainage utilities were transferred over to EPCOR in 2017, which Walter said sparked the shift. So one or two champions on city council can really take results like this and drive behavior to further flood preparedness. In Winnipeg, the response there was, for example, Winnipeg Councillor Matt Allard commented to the Toronto Star that the report raises concerns, and that may be just the type of thing that gives a city councillor like me an opportunity to move a motion, ask for a report, and get costing on it. So this is good. This is the whole point, drive behavior forward. Fredericton suggested or said that in response to this report, or the report release, the city of Edmonton has agreed to distribute the 3 steps to home flood protection infographic to all households, which was it's basic guidance on what you can do around the outside of your property, the basement itself, to lower the probability of basement flooding. A few key takeaways for me for the report was that overall recognition that flood risk is getting more challenging is on the increase. There's better recognition on the need to address system failures, infrastructure failures for continuity of electricity supply, telecommunication services, transportation networks, etc. 70% of the cities we examined, at least the 16, had resiliency officers or the equivalent thereof, like one person who could be sort of one-stop shopping on resiliency or have a big part of the equation. One of the key findings that we found by way of unsolicited commentary from many individuals that responded to this was that the eligibility for disaster financial assistance arrangements, bailout money, if you will, from the federal government to the provinces following, or to the cities and or subsectors of provinces following a flood, should be dependent on cities having up-to-date flood risk maps. And cities, many people said the reason they don't produce up-to-date flood risk maps is if they do and then they get flooding, they may not be eligible for DFAA assistance, but if they don't have the up-to-date flood risk maps and the flood hits, there's a much higher chance that they will be eligible for bailout money. So in other words, they were saying the incentive for the program is backwards. And next slide and last slide. Just to end on a bit of a high note, I do think that for Canada as a whole, we should take pride in the fact that we are doing a lot of work as a country to figure out for the primary factor that costs us the most when things go wrong, which is flooding, through efforts led by the National Research Council, the Standards Council of Canada, Canadian Standards Association. I would like to say the Intact Center is in this group, and scores of organizations that you would know well. Canada has developed very, very good guidance on practical, meaningful, and cost-effective flood risk mitigation to be applied at the level of the home, going counterclockwise from the upper left-hand corner, at the level of the home, new community design, flood risk mitigation for existing communities, for commercial real estate, for the role natural infrastructure can play in mitigating risk. We're about 2 months away or 3 months away from releasing a new report in Canada, guidance on flood risk coastline resiliency standard for the country, for the East and West Coast, Atlantic and Pacific, to deal with sea level rise, storm surge, and king tides. The only thing that's missing now from the equation for Canada on flood risk is we need to develop a Great Lakes shoreline resiliency guideline or standard. And that'll be created, I think, within the next 2 years. So the good news is we know what to do to mitigate flood risk. The bad news is perhaps we're not moving quite fast enough. It's one thing to know to be going in the right direction. And if you're in a little car heading down the highway with a certain goal in mind, that's all good. But if you've got a tractor trailer coming up behind you at twice your speed, it's not good enough to be going in the right direction. You got to speed up. And right now, in my view, at least, the tractor trailer is extreme weather. We got to move faster. Thank you very much.